Okay, so we are live. Perfect. Awesome. I'll just give about a minute or so for some other people to join, and then we'll get started.
Yay.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so we should be good here. So welcome everyone to our live Q&A with Jessica Moorhouse. I'm very, very excited. For those of you that don't know me, I am the operations manager at Encircle. My name is Jess, 2 Jesses on this webinar today. And today we're just going to be asking Jessica some questions that we've had they've been submitted, and we've kind of gone through. A lot of them were the same, so we've grouped them together, and we'll just run through the questions. And then if there are any questions you have during this live, we can go through that at the end for everybody. So I'll just kind of intro Jessica Moorhouse a bit. So she is a money expert, speaker, accredited financial counselor, award-winning blogger, host of the Mo Money podcast, and founder of the Millennial Money Meetup. Jessica's main passion is personal finance and living a balanced lifestyle. And ever since she discovered the transformative powers of financial literacy, her mission has been to teach others to take control of their lives by taking control of their money. So I'm so excited to go through everything today. Welcome.
Me too. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Of course, of course. So we will kind of just jump into the questions here and go through everything. I'm very excited to learn about this myself.
Yay.
Okay, so we had someone say that they find it hard to stick to a budget and save as much as they would like. Do you have any tips on this?
Yeah, I hear that a lot. And I could talk for an hour on budgeting, but I won't do that to everybody. I think what I usually tell people when they're like, I just can't stick to a budget. I think that's because you may have not thought about it in kind of the bigger context of, well, why do you want to have a budget? What are you saving for? Why do you want to save money? Why do you want to spend less? What's the overall purpose? And that goes back to really having some clear, defined financial goals. So that's kind of why in like the budget spreadsheet that I usually provide to people and the one that I use, at the top, it kind of starts with that kind of mindset. Like, what are we saving towards? What do we want? Do we want to go on a trip? Are we saving for a wedding? Are we saving for a down payment on a home, retirement, new car, anything you can think of? Start with a list of what do I want in life? Like maybe it's going back to school, all these kinds of things, because that's kind of more exciting and motivating. And then you kind of work backwards. How do I achieve those? And that's when you kind of take a look at your income, your expenses, and see how we can kind of work with both of them so we can actually achieve some of those goals. So I think when you're working with a budget, you've got a template and you're like, I don't even know where to start. Start with, what do you want your money to do? What do you want? And then I think that'll be a little bit easier to kind of digest some of the decisions you have to make with your budget.
For sure. Because sometimes those templates can be really overwhelming when you're just kind of staring at the screen. It's like, but once you have a goal in mind, it's kind of like a funnel. Like you've got your goal and then you just kind of work backwards from there. So that's
Exactly.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, that's great. Someone was wanting some recommendations on where to start with investing, which can be very overwhelming if it's not something that you've done before. I know I feel that myself. They said they have some savings that can possibly be good for long-term investment earnings. Where should they begin? And maybe we'll start with that. And they have a kind of more specific question about some different platforms as well. So we can kind of go through that.
I think, it can be overwhelming because it can seem like there's so many options and you get advice from your parents, get advice from, people you work with. You don't know what the right thing to do is. So I think it's really important to understand what are your options first and then kind of whittle down what makes the most sense for me. So first, of course, you can go to the bank and you can, work with an advisor there and they can manage your portfolio for you. You can also work with a private investment firm. They do the same thing. Those can be great if you need that advice. You need someone to really help you one-on-one, but they can be expensive. And especially with lots of those financial firms that are private, they have a very high threshold. They won't work with you unless you have a certain amount of money. So most of us, like millennials, younger people, we can't even afford to work with some of these firms. But typically anyone can kind of walk in the bank and be like, I want to invest with you, and they can help you. But the thing to remember is usually there's that threshold, or the fees are just way higher than some of your other options. Other options that are kind of becoming a lot more popular now, which is exciting, is robo-advisors. And I think lots of us have heard about this or have seen ads for a few robo-advisors, but most people have no idea what the heck that actually means or what it is. It's really just an online platform that helps you invest in a certain portfolio. And how it's kind of organized, and pretty much all robo-advisors in Canada are the same. They will kind of pre-build a bunch of portfolios of ETFs, which is a type of investment product, similar to like a mutual fund. And then you go through this kind of investor profile questionnaires, what they call it. You answer a bunch of questions so they can kind of determine, what are your investment goals? Like, why are you investing? What's your time horizon? How long do you have to invest before you need that money? What's your risk tolerance? Are you like very risk averse? Are you okay taking some risk? And then based off all these factors, they'll kind of recommend a certain portfolio for you, which you can change at any time. So you're not stuck in it.
Which is nice. That's good.
Exactly. So nothing's ever, even when you're working with a bank or anything, nothing's set in stone. You will change it at some point as your life and your needs change. And then you basically invest in that portfolio, and all you have to do is just contribute money to it so it grows. But the platform, they rebalance it, they invest your money for you, they do all the heavy lifting. And then the last kind of option, and this is more for if maybe you already have some expertise when it comes to investing, is called self-directed investing or DIY investing. So that just means that you open up your own, it's called a discount brokerage account. So there's, lots of companies like Questrade and TD Direct Investing as examples, where basically you open an account and you can do whatever you want. You can buy stocks, you can buy ETFs, but you're your own portfolio manager. So there is some risk involved because you can make a mistake.
Yeah, you're doing it all.
So when you kind of understand those are the options, then you can kind of take a look at what makes me the most comfortable. And then you can kind of look at what the big differences are between all of them.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And specifically, going off of this question, kind of the second part of it, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but they specifically were wondering, like, are Wealthsimple, which we hear about a lot, or Acorn a good option if they're kind of just venturing out into the investing space?
Definitely. So say you've kind of done your research, you kind of see what your options are, and you decide, I want to use a robo-advisor. Then you take a look at what are your options. So in Canada, there's maybe 6 or maybe a bit more, I can't remember the exact number of robo-advisors. So there's not a huge pool, which is kind of nice. So you don't have too much options. Wealthsimple is definitely one of them. I'd say it's probably one of the bigger ones in Canada. They definitely spend the most money on advertising. So that's why everyone knows about that name. And for Acorn, you mentioned, so that's just based out of the US. So that's not available to us in Canada, but it is something you can use in the US. Now, when you are comparing different robo-advisors, the things to look out for are, first, what are the fees that they charge? Some of them charge a little bit lower of a management fee. And so the fee structure when it comes to robo-advisors, not to get too technical, is basically you will pay like maybe 0.5% as a pretty average management fee. So that is the fee that you're paying just for the platform to manage your portfolio for you. And then you're also paying the MER on the ETFs in the portfolio. So there's kind of two main fees lumped together, and that's your overall fee. So maybe together you'll be paying 0.8% or something like that. So that's one consideration, is looking at the different robo-advisors and seeing what's their fee structure. Who's the cheapest, who's the most expensive? And then also taking a look at what kind of portfolios do they offer. Some of them only offer, you've got 10 options, that's all you got. And some of them will actually give you a little bit more flexibility, and based off, working with you, will customize something. So they may have like hundreds of options. So seeing like what's the flexibility. And then of course, looking at different considerations like what's the initial contribution. Typically, they'll require you to invest at least $1,000 to start with. And just also taking things like, okay, what's their customer service like? What's their platform like? Is it, easy to use, user friendly? And what are reviews? Go online, see what people are saying and talking about. And then I'd say once you do your research, choose one and get started.
Yeah, that's, you got to take a leap.
Yeah, there's too many things to think about. And so then they don't, and they delay it for a year. And when you delay it, you're basically not building on, your money. You're not growing your wealth for a whole year, which is,
and it's kind of that sometimes it's the fear of the unknown. It's just, you just have to get started at some point,
you
right?
do. And I went through the exact same thing. So I totally understand that too. Like several years ago, I was using a bank to do my investments. I wanted to switch it up. I wasn't happy. And so I looked at robo-advisors, and I chose two because I wanted to kind of see what the difference would be. And I just got started, and it was really scary at first. But I've been investing with them for now, I want to 3 to 4 years now. And I've been very happy. I really like it.
Yeah, as long as you're doing your research, you just have to start somewhere and then go from there. And if down the line, maybe you're not super happy with the one you chose, you can always go to some, like there's so many options, like you said.
That's the thing. If you choose one robo-advisor and I'd say stick it out for at least a year because you won't really see much of a difference if you do something shorter than that. If you're like, this is not for me, I want to use maybe a different robo-advisor, you can 100% move. And that doesn't mean, I think a lot of people ask me this, like, so does that mean I'm like withdrawing money from my TFSA or RRSP? Absolutely not. You can do a straight transfer to somewhere else. So you're just basically transferring it somewhere else. You don't get taxed or anything like that. So you do, again, you're not stuck. If you stay one place, you can move, but that's okay.
See, that's a great tip. I did not know that. So that is great. That is good to know. Perfect. So that's awesome. So someone else was wondering, how should I balance paying down debt and saving at the same time? Would you recommend paying down debt first before starting to save? Which is a very good question. I know a lot of people struggle with this.
Yeah. And it really depends on the situation, but typically when someone comes to me and they have that question, should I save or pay down debt? I personally think you should be doing always both at the same time. I know there's a lot of other experts, especially in the States, that have certain kind of strategies of just like paying down debt aggressively, and that should be your main focus. And that can be dangerous because for instance, if you just focus on debt repayment, but you didn't put any money away for your emergency fund, guess what happens when you're in an emergency? You have to get into debt again. You have to put on your credit card or line of credit. And then you kind of wiped out all the hard work you did. So it's really important to focus on building up that emergency fund first, which is about 3 to 6 months of your living expenses. And then really start aggressively paying down your debt. Now, while you're saving up for that emergency fund, you're still paying your minimum required or maybe a little bit more on your debts, but really focus on having that built up first, and then you can start focusing on debt.
That makes sense. And I mean, if 2020 has taught us anything, having an emergency fund is super important, and especially for millennials too, that like our generation hasn't gone through something this difficult before. So it's super important. I think everyone is really learning that having, like, you can't just pay down debt constantly. You have to have something kind of fall back on, right?
Exactly. Yeah. If this year has taught us anything, it's how important it is to have something tucked away, because you just never know. And I think a lot of people, especially like you mentioned, have never experienced a big financial emergency. And until you do, you may not really understand. And it's like, I definitely have. I've had bouts of unemployment. I've had to buy a flight pretty quickly to go to a funeral across the country. These things pop up, and people, may have experienced, like, your car breaks down. That's expensive.
Or your pet is sick or
your
something.
Pet is sick.
Yeah.
Anything can happen. So it's just good to be safe.
Yeah, for sure. No, I totally get that. And I mean, it's a tough lesson to learn, but I think it's good that this is happening. So that
it's a good learning lesson, I think, for lots of us. A nice reminder. Yeah.
You have to look at the bright side of what's happened so far in 2020.
Yeah.
Perfect. So this one's a little more specific. So how much of my income, this person wants to know, should I aim to put into RRSPs and or other types of investments?
Great question. I get a lot of questions about rules of thumb, which are helpful for a place to start, but I think sometimes they can be very limiting, and sometimes it's not a good idea. So typically is what you'll see is people are saying, put away 20% of your net income towards your retirement savings. Sounds like a good number. Sometimes it's like, oh, that's like a lot of money. That's great. But it always goes back to how much do you actually need in the end? So let's kind of talk about like saving for a trip. You're not just like putting away $100 a month and we're like, yeah, I'm sure I'll have enough by the time I need it. You figure out how much do I need for that trip, and then you work backwards to find out how much per month should I contribute so I can reach that goal in 1 or 2 years. So you do the same thing with retirement savings. You don't just say, oh, put away 20%, because what is 20%? Like, that's a percentage. Who knows? It's also like very difficult because like everyone earns different income, so that's different amounts for everybody.
You can't have the same amount across the board.
Which
makes sense.
And so figuring out how much do I basically, what is my kind of retirement income requirement? So when I'm retired, how much annual income do I want or need? And so there's lots of great retirement calculators that can help you out figuring out that number. Again, it'll change as your life changes, but it's good just to have kind of a starting point and then kind of work backwards. So let's say, okay, I need $1 million by the time I retire, which I know sounds like a crazy amount of money.
Not really. Yeah. Not nowadays. Yeah.
Not nowadays when houses are like $1 million.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's say, you have $1 million as your kind of amount that you need for retirement. You would work backwards by figuring out, okay, how many years do I have to save up to that number? And let's say it's 30 years. And then you would use like a retirement calculator or a compound interest calculator to figure out, okay, so if I were to put away $100 a month and I was getting like, 5% per year, would I reach that amount? And if not, then go back to the drawing board and figure out how much. And there's lots of calculators that'll work differently, where it's like, you'll have how much do you need, and it'll tell you automatically how much you should save every month or on a regular basis, every paycheck or something like that. So I would do that instead of just using the 20% rule.
Well, yeah. And sometimes too, when you just have like, you use the example of a trip. Sometimes you're like, I'm going to go on a trip, but you don't actually like get the monthly breakdown of what you need to save. So then it becomes overwhelming and then you're right before the trip and you don't have enough. And then your finances are all out of balance, right? So it's so important, like you said at the beginning, to have that goal and then work backwards from there, right? I think that's the biggest thing, the planning.
And you could do that with any kind of financial goal too, which is exciting. Like it could be a trip. It could be like one thing that I actually do myself and with clients is a shopping kind of savings account. So most of us don't go shopping for clothes every single month on the dot and spend the exact same amount every single month. It might actually make sense to contribute a percentage of your net income to a savings account. It'll build and build and build. And then by the time you're going to go, with your friends on a shopping spree, you've got some money tucked away and now you know how much you can spend. It's as much as that's in that account.
Yeah, no, I know I always struggle with that because you're right. Like 1 month, you might not know that you need a new winter jacket, like in a month's time or something. So it's going to be different. And 1 month you'll buy an expensive winter jacket, and then 1 month you won't buy anything, right? So it's just it makes sense. Exactly.
Yeah,
that's great. Okay, next question that someone submitted. They said they're starting a new job after a career change. How can they ensure they set themselves up for financial success and safety from the get-go?
That's a good question. Well, yeah, because there's a lot of variables and it depends on what you're doing already. But typically, if you're like, I've never really paid attention to my money and I don't like it, I want to have some sense of clarity and some organization. It really comes down to making a budget. And all a budget means, like, it doesn't have to be a crazy spreadsheet, though I do love a good spreadsheet.
Yeah, same.
It's really just figuring out like, what is your gross income? Then what is your net income? So that's your income after deductions and taxes. So if you work for an employer, they take care of that. What's going into your bank account is just your net income. So figuring out how much money do I actually have to play with, and then figuring out what are your savings goals? What do we want to save towards? What are your fixed expenses? So those are like your necessities, your bills and subscriptions and things that you have to pay, your debts, for example, and then your variable expenses. So those are things that can be necessities, sometimes not, but typically the amount you spend on those amounts, like groceries, takeout, and stuff like that, vary every single month. Figuring out, laying all that information out, playing around with those numbers once you've laid them out to kind of tweak things so they work a little bit better. Then you'll have a sense of like, okay, on payday, where's my money going? And then you can even create, because I'm a big nerd, create like a cash flow design where it's like money will go into my checking account, and then $200 is going to go into this savings account, $100 into this one, $300 to my second checking account that's linked to my debit card. And I'm only using that for variable expenses, and all my fixed expenses are going onto my credit card. And I know I just pay that off automatically. Creating a system so on payday, you can either make those kind of flows of in and out, either automatic or manual, but you know exactly what to do on payday.
Yeah, exactly. And once you have a plan in place like that, it may be a little bit obviously you help clients and stuff with this, it may be a little bit to plan it all out, but then once it's automatic, it's just easy and you just get so used to it, right? Which is awesome.
And automatic, especially when it comes to savings, is one of the best things I ever learned when I was in my 20s, because there's a lot of books that talked about, make it automatic. I'm like, okay, sure. I'll try it out and we'll see if it's actually as great as you say. But I've been doing it for basically 10 years now. And it's actually incredible because you rarely actually notice when these automatic transfers happen. And so you kind of adjust your spending because you kind of see how much do I have left to spend? And then you only spend that amount. If you kind of leave it to your own devices and manual, most likely there's a very good chance you'll end up spending that money instead of saving it. Because I think our just nature is to spend, not save.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, if you see it in your account, you're like, oh, okay, I have this. But if it's automatically just being transferred and you set up all these automatic transfers, then whatever you're left with, that's what you're left with. But you're setting yourself up for success, which is the great thing, right? So,
and sometimes I hear, I mean, even with my husband who, it's funny because it's like, I love talking about money. He does not. So it's taken him a while to really get comfortable about it.
Yes.
But a few years ago, we, set up, he's been self-employed for as long as I've known him, so over like 13 years. And he used to always complain, I just never have that much to put towards my investments because, my income is up and down because I'm self-employed. And then I became self-employed and I'm like, well, that's not true because I can figure it out. So there's definitely a way we could figure it out for you. And so we set up a system where, he has kind of this funnel account where there's always like a good buffer amount of money. And then money is automatically transferred to his investments. He's had it automatically. And he's like, sometimes forgets it's going on in the background. And then once in a while, when he looks at his investment, guy's like, oh, wow, where'd all that money come from?
And it's such a nice feeling. Yeah, it's such a nice feeling. Like you just have to set it up and then then you get kind of hooked on it. Like once you see it happening, it's like, okay, this is great. I love this.
It's exciting to see your wealth grow, especially when you feel like I don't earn that much. But it's like, believe me, I did not earn that much in my 20s. I was definitely earning like the lowest you possibly could. And somehow through automatic, deposits or transfers, I was able to save money. And I don't I'm like, I don't know how, but somehow I did it and it happened automatically. So
yeah. And you just adjust to it, right? It's just all about adjusting. That's great. That's very good tips. So this one a little bit more specific as well, but great question. They have a bit of savings, but not sure where to put it if their objective is long-term growth. Would you recommend investing in real estate, TFSA, stocks, or RRSPs?
So, a few things with that I think are great that I can't wait to answer. So I get this a lot. People are like, should I invest in RRSP or TFSA? So what's really important to know is those are actually not investments. Those are accounts. Those are account types, right? So there's just a vehicle or a basket where you can put stocks or bonds, or mutual funds in there. So let's just kind of put that aside. Those are just a different account types that you would decide which one to put into once you've already figured out what do I actually want to invest in. So now determining what kind of investment product or security should I invest in, you would figure out first, what is your goal? So if it's long-term growth for, let's say, retirement, so you have a long time that you can invest, and depending on like your age too, that's also a big factor. So you have 30 years and you're in your 30s, you can technically take on a little bit more risk than say if you're 50 and approaching retirement. And so what that looks like is really looking at the different types of investment products that would fit into that category. So typically, stocks or kind of stock-based products. So like equity ETFs, equity mutual funds, equity index funds, things like that. But then again, you also want to be diversified. So you don't want to just put all of your money in like stocks, equities. You want to make sure you have a portion of your overall investment portfolio into fixed income or bonds or bond products. So that could be like individual bonds, T-bills, GICs, or fixed income type mutual funds, ETFs, index funds, and stuff like that. So I know that's a lot of gibberish.
Yeah. It makes sense.
It makes sense. It's a lot. You're like, okay, I understood some of that. But really the thing to kind of take away is figure out what your goal is, figure out again, how much do you need? And then also figure out how much risk can I take on? And then figure out what kind of investment products would fit into that goal and into that time horizon that I want to work with. And usually what's really helpful too, is there's so many great, again, calculators and questionnaires, especially like risk tolerance ones that will kind of, you put in your information and it will tell you, based on this information, this is the portfolio that we see for you. Something like a 80-20 split of equities and fixed income, something like that.
There's a lot of great resources out there. It's just about like empowering yourself, right?
Yeah. And especially too, if you do like work with an advisor or a robo-advisor, they will guide you in figuring out what you should actually invest in. Yeah.
No, that's perfect. Okay. This one is a really interesting one. So how can I invest in ethical, environmentally friendly companies? Their mutual fund at the bank includes big oil and other companies that don't share the values that they have.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's becoming a lot more popular, this idea of sustainable investing. There's lots of different words for it, but it's like socially responsible investing, whatever you want to call it. And what's great is there's a lot more companies coming out with products that fit this need, and they all work a bit different. So what's really important is first, again, figuring out who's offering these products. So lots of these robo-advisors do provide portfolios that fit that need. And lots of investment firms and banks also provide like mutual funds and stuff like that that do also fit that criteria. But there's you still have to look into what companies are actually in that fund and make sure that those companies fit your value system, because sometimes there will be an oil company in there. And the reason could be that the creator of that fund wants to have a voice with that oil company to create positive change. So there's actually lots of little things. I did a couple of videos with another company about, or just one video specifically about this kind of theme of sustainable investing. So there is kind of a little bit to know, but basically where I'd start is figuring out who's offering these things. And then you do your due diligence to find out, am I cool with all the companies in there? Because you may not, because they all have different criteria for what means sustainable to them.
Okay, that's very interesting. I didn't even know that that would be something like if you went to speak to somebody like, I'm looking for sustainable investing, like that makes sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, not everyone offers them, but a lot more are offering them. And especially if you're a DIY investor too, you can do the research for like, what are the mutual funds or ETFs that are available that fit that criteria, and you can invest in them, or you can work with an advisor or use a robo-advisor.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, great. Another more specific one. So this person has paid off debts and maxed out their TFSA. Should they start contributing to their RRSP? They are employed and 25 years old and making $50,000 a year, just for some reference.
Yeah. So I would say, if you're basically ran out of room of your TFSA and you want to continue to invest, then definitely use your RRSP. I'd always say use your tax efficient accounts before moving on to a taxable account so you can save on taxes. Yep. The great thing though, is if you're earning $50,000 a year and you actually don't really need the tax deduction benefit the RRSP provides, you don't have to use it in the year that you make your contributions. You can contribute to an RRSP and you can save up that deduction room for a year in the future where you're earning higher income, you're in a higher tax bracket, and you actually really need that tax deduction.
That makes sense. Awesome. And then someone was asking, what is the best way to diversify RRSPs for long-term growth? For example, percentage of high, medium, low risk.
Right. That's interesting. So, I think, there's a couple things in there. So if we're talking about risk, then that kind of looks like maybe you have different goals. So, because typically you would have kind of one specific risk profile and goals and everything like that for like retirement. But if for instance, you were saving for a down payment on a home and you only have 5 years, that would be a different risk profile because you can't take on as much risk because you need that cash sooner than in retirement. So I think what you would do is break down your goals, and you can still house all that money in your RRSP in that one account, but really figure out what your different goals are, and then create or work with someone to create different portfolios within that RRSP for those different goals.
Okay. That makes sense. No, that totally makes sense. That's cool. That's very cool. Okay. So we're at the point of kind of opening up. There's already some questions that have come into the chat, which is very exciting. So I'm just going to kind of start asking, and we can go through that because we have lots of time. So it's nice to kind of go through it live. So Katrina is asking, I've read that at a later age, she's 42, is it better to invest less in stocks and ETFs and invest in more safer options?
That's a good question. I think so. 42, that's still relatively young, but maybe it's because I'm getting older. So I think that's like, that's young, right? So that's a great question. I think the thing you would want to determine is, when do you actually want to retire? If you're planning on retiring by 50, that's very different if you plan on retiring at 65 or 70. So because there's a good 10 years on you. But typically as you get older and you are approaching retirement quicker and you have a smaller time horizon, you do want to take on less risk. That doesn't mean though that you don't want to invest in stocks or equity-based, ETFs or mutual funds or anything like that. It just means you may want to have your asset allocation, which is the amount of equities and fixed income in your portfolio, to be a bit different. So most likely you would not be in a portfolio that's like 90% equities, 10% fixed income. That's way too high risk for someone like you. So you may want to do something that's maybe a 70-30 or 60-40. Again, what's important is to figure out that time horizon, and then take a look at some of those risk calculators, or talk to an advisor or use a robo-advisor, and they'll be able to come up with like, here's, based off these factors, a good risk profile for you and good asset allocation for you.
That makes sense. And everything kind of goes back to what you said in the first question, like you have to have your goal. So if your retirement goal is 50, or if it's 65, then you just work backwards from there. So
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the important thing that a lot of people don't realize too, is once you hit retirement, you don't cash out everything. Like you're still invested in money.
Yeah.
So don't ever think that you're like, it's you adjust your asset allocation. So by the time you retire at 65, everything's in fixed income. You're still going to be investing in equities or stocks and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally makes sense. But it's not something that is really talked about that often, right?
No,
it's more
I used
like,
to, for the longest time, I'm like, so when I retire, just like take all my cash. It's like,
yeah, like what's happening? Yeah.
Don't do that. No.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. We have lots of great questions. So Suzanne asks, can you explain the difference between a TFSA and other savings accounts, and potentially what you would use a TFSA for, and maybe the pros and cons? It's a great question.
Yeah. So when it comes to specific savings accounts, really you've got your taxable savings account. So it's just a regular savings account. You've got your tax-free savings account, which can be used as a savings account, but I would actually argue that the best use for it is actually investing. And then typically, like technically you can use your RRSP for a savings account. I wouldn't, because you don't want to touch that money, because when you touch that money, you have to pay tax on it before retirement. So don't do that. And also in retirement, you're also taxed on that money. So don't do that. So if we're talking about just like a savings account for a short-term goal, like for a vacation, I usually recommend just using your taxable account. You're probably not going to be earning that much interest right now, very low interest rates. So the amount of tax you're going to be paying, which is basically 100% on that interest on your marginal tax rate, is going to be very minimal. It's not going to be that big of a deal. Your TFSA, it's such a great vehicle more for investing, because you can earn so much more on your investments than on 1 or 2% on your savings account.
Yeah.
So might as well use all that room for your investments. And the great thing too with the TFSA is, even though you can, withdraw and you don't get taxed on it, what a lot of people do if they use a TFSA for their emergency fund or for some other kind of savings purpose, they withdraw and then withdraw, deposit throughout the year. And whenever you do that, you may actually be over contributing the amount that you can for your TFSA, and then you get taxed on that, which we don't want. So that's usually my kind of rule of thumb, is save the TFSA if you can for your investments.
Yeah. Okay. That's great tips. Sam asks, how do you keep track of your various accounts across institutions? Do you have different savings accounts for different goals? This is a great question, because I love organization. So
I love that question. So what I personally do to keep track of all, because I honestly, because I like to try out new things too. And so I've got accounts at so many different places. One easy way is honestly in just like a bookmark tab on my browser. I have all the institutions listed. So I can go to this folder that I created called finances, and I know all the banks that I'm banking with or whatever. But another thing too is when you're creating that cash flow design, like I mentioned, you can write in this is, this bank, and this is this robo-advisor, and have it all, kind of written down. But another place too that I haven't really touched on. So this was something that I recommend when you have your budget, and also I recommend tracking your spending so you know where your money's going. Also track your net worth. And so that's really writing down every month, or you can do it every quarter, every year, how much money is in all of your different accounts. And so when you lay that out, you can see, I do this every single month. You'll see in all your different checking accounts of different institutions, where are they and how much is in there?
Yeah. Kind of like a state of what's happening, like where am I at, kind of thing.
Exactly. And going to the part of, should I use, or do you use different accounts, different places for different purposes? Absolutely. So for me, I use one bank for my kind of day-to-day banking. I have my checking accounts, some savings accounts. I've got a joint account with my husband. Then I use a couple of robo-advisors and some discount brokerages for my investments. So that's at a lot of different places. Then I also use another institution for some savings accounts, because they offer higher interest than my day-to-day bank. So I definitely do that. And as long as you keep it organized and don't forget where everything is.
Yes, you never want to forget. It's good to diversify though. Why not? Because if you just stay in the same, and I used to do this, just stay with the same bank and do the same thing, you're not going to get different results, right? So it's nice to,
And just there's different, institutions or robo-advisors or places that offer different benefits. So if you kind of, you look, if you want to really optimize your benefits, you may get the best value. One thing I hear is, can I have a credit card at a different place than where I bank? Absolutely. You can have a credit card at any kind of bank. You don't actually have to have a checking account with them. And that might be great because maybe this other bank has a credit card that has way better features than the place that you actually bank at.
Yeah, it's finding what works for you, right?
Exactly.
No, that's perfect. Brina asks, when saving for house down payment, would you suggest putting it in a savings account or a local risk investment?
Maybe a low risk investment.
Low, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, it kind of depends on when do you need that money. So that'll kind of determine if you need that money in a year, just put it in a savings account. We don't want to mess with that. Because like, can you imagine like being, invested right now and you need to take your money out in 6 months to buy a home and then all this happens and then the value of your investments went down? It would have been much safer to keep that in cash. But if you have a little bit of a longer time horizon, maybe 3 to 5 years, you can take a look at some different investment options that are low risk. So, a fund like an ETF or a bond or a mutual fund that has a big exposure to fixed income. You can also look at GICs, and there's lots of different types of GICs. Honestly, sometimes you have to take a look and like, can I actually earn more money on this bond fund compared to a savings account too? So that's another thing to consider. But there's, GICs where, you're locked in for a certain amount of years. So that might be fine for like, it's okay, I'm not going to take the money out for 5 years. But there's also cashable GICs that offer lower interest, but you can after a certain point, usually 30 to 90 days after buying into it, you can cash it out. So there's a couple different options out there.
And it really depends like when you are looking to put the down payment on the house, right?
Like that's always, it's like, when do you want the money? It's usually the answer or the question after your question.
For sure. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but Marion is asking, can you talk about tools like Wealthsimple, Robinhood, which I haven't heard of actually. They want to start investing short-term, long-term, but don't know where to start besides at the bank, which she would like to do to avoid management fees. So 100%. Maybe, we can go over that a little bit.
One thing I should mention, in Canada, there are 2 banks that do offer robo-advisors. So if you're like, I kind of like, I have a checking account, the same as accounts at this, RBC or BMO are the 2 banks. They actually do offer their own robo-advisors, and they have similar, I think, fee structures to all the other robo-advisors. So that's one option. But otherwise, every other robo-advisor is kind of independent from a bank. Let me answer the first question, which is like, Wealthsimple versus Robinhood. So Robinhood is an app available only in the US, not Canada. And it's more of a trading app. And from all my American friends, it is way too easy to invest with it. So I'd say I wouldn't use Robinhood if I wasn't comfortable with the risk that you're taking on as basically buying individual stocks and securities and stuff like that. Is basically the same thing as opening up a discount brokerage with like, Questrade or TD Direct Investing or whoever, and buying your own investments. But I think Robinhood just makes it a little bit easier because it's an app and
it's just
all this kind of stuff. Like there's some interesting stories. I would definitely suggest you Google Robinhood. There's some interesting media stories that come out from people that are young and didn't have the know-how and lost a lot of money because they made a bunch of mistakes. So, if you're a beginner investor, I probably wouldn't dive in there. I would probably look into using maybe a robo-advisor because again, it's kind of the benefit of working with a bank is they deal with it for you. Robo-advisor is similar. Some of the downsides is like there's no branches. If you want to talk to somebody, you have to phone them or web chat and stuff like that. I think us millennials are pretty used to that, so it's actually not that big of a deal. But it's all online, which is actually pretty nice and accessible. And they can, again, you can change your portfolio, and lots of the, not lots, but a few of the robo-advisors like Wealthsimple, for instance, does have a trading platform now as well. So you can actually do that as well if you want to. But
that's great.
Long story short, if you're a beginner, look for a robo-advisor and kind of understand what's that look like.
Yeah, and some beginners too. It's nice to know. I did not know that about. I think you said BMO and
RBC.
Yeah, it's nice to know because sometimes some people might want that security of knowing it's a banking institution that also offers that. So that's good. That's awesome.
So BMO's is called BMO Smartfolio, and RBC is RBC Investees. One thing I should mention, because I feel like you sort of touched on it, and I hear this a lot, is it safe though? And a lot of people assume that if you bank, if you invest with the bank, you're safer than with some of these independent robo-advisors because they're new and you've never heard of them. And they actually all share the same level of safeness in terms of if that institution was to default to go into bankruptcy, they're all covered under IROC. And so, or there's a specific fund really, but It's similar to like, is my cash safe at the bank? CDIC protects you. There is protection for your investments. Now that does not include protection in terms of your, the market value of your investments. If, a company you invest in their stock and it goes bankrupt, I mean, that's a different story. You're not going to be covered, but otherwise they all share the same level of safeness in terms of that. Yeah.
That is great to know. Lots of questions come in. Okay. So Jillian is asking, when trying to pay off debt from a student line of credit and OSAP, do you recommend transferring the OSAP debt to a personal line of credit because of the high interest rate? It's a great question.
So you're saying the student line of credit has a higher interest rate than the student loan rather has a higher interest rate than the line of credit?
Yes, than the personal line of credit. So wondering if should take the OSAP debt and transfer to a personal line of credit.
That's a good question. I think one reason you may not want to do that is there's some tax credits that you no longer be able to claim that you can on student loan interest if you transfer it over to a line of credit. So that's one thing to think about. But another thing is with lines of credit, and there's been lots of kind of stories in the media with everything that's been going on, technically they can request that you repay everything you borrowed whenever they want. So there's a little less security. I don't think they really would do that because it'd be a bad PR
nightmare.
Yeah, not good for them, but they do, there is kind of that risk. So you have to kind of figure out what makes the most sense. I personally like the kind of security of the student loans because you are borrowing from the government. But yeah, I guess it depends on how high the interest rate is. It's up to you. And very well, you could always transfer some of it to your line of credit and pay that off and, slowly move it. You don't have to move the whole thing.
Yeah, just kind of in smaller chunks kind of thing. That makes sense. So Sam is asking, what's a comfortable amount to keep in your checking account? I want my money to work for me, but worry about a comfortable bubble, even though I have an emergency fund. That's a great question.
That's a great question. So it kind of depends on how you use your checking account or where you bank. So if you bank somewhere and they're like, oh, we're going to waive the monthly fee if you keep $5,000 in your checking account, I'm never a big fan of that because that's $5,000 you're most likely earning 0.01% on.
Yeah, like
and
nothing.
So that's no good. And so it might be worth it to look for a no-fee bank that doesn't have that restriction. But otherwise, if you use your checking account where money flows in and from there you have your automatic transfers to pay your bills and move it to your savings accounts and all that kind of stuff, you will want some buffer money in there because you don't want to constantly be looking at it and it's slowly going to zero and you're like, oh, I hope I don't actually go into overdraft. And so with that, you'd have to take a look at how much makes me feel comfortable. Maybe $1,000 is good, maybe a little bit more, something like that.
Yeah. And it's all based on your income as well, right? Like it's going to be different for everybody.
Yeah.
Okay. Serena asks, what tips would you give for repayment of OSAP money? Should I pay it off ASAP or repay it in smaller chunks?
I guess it depends on, do you have any other debt that's higher interest? So if so, definitely focus on the high interest debt. I always kind of say, focus on all your high interest debt before aggressively paying off like your student loans or your car loans, your mortgages, because typically they have lower interest. But let's say you don't have any other debt and you just want to focus on that. Again, it comes back to what is the interest rate. So if it is, fairly high, like 6%, I would say probably just focus on paying that down. But if it's maybe a little bit lower, then maybe you have a bit more flexibility in terms of, aggressively paying down that and then, investing. I mean, I feel in general though, if you have student loans and you're paying those down and you're young, I'd say definitely save and invest at the same time. Yeah, because I don't know. It's funny because like growing up, or especially in my 20s, I was so against debt. I thought debt was the worst. And now that I know so much more, it's actually not the worst. It's actually not that bad of a loan. It's like you needed it for school. And I think it's fine if it does take you a little bit longer, if at the same time you're also putting the money away into savings and your investments and growing your wealth.
For sure. And sometimes debt means that you're just investing in your future. You're going to school, you're maybe looking at buying a house, all that stuff, right? So
And there's also the different little techniques too that you can do. For instance, if ever you get a little bit of extra money, either like a side hustle or a bonus at work, you could prioritize paying off your debt instead of putting that bonus towards investments or just spending it. You can be like, this is a little, it's called like this debt snowflake kind of method. You could just lump it onto your student loan so you can pay it off a little bit quicker.
Because you weren't expecting it anyway, right? Like you're fine the way you are. So if you get that extra, I've heard of some friends of mine doing that and it's great. It makes so much sense, right?
That's a great idea if you get a tax refund too. And you're like, most people just blow it. It's like, well, maybe put it on your
Yeah,
debt.
exactly. Well, and like you said too, when you were just saying it's so important to look at your debt and see which ones have the highest interest rates and things like that. And I think that all comes back to being organized and just not, because you can sometimes, as you're paying off debt, you kind of forget what interest rate is which and what you're paying and which one is the highest. And so it's so good to have that wherever you organize it. I would probably do like a spreadsheet or something.
Oh yeah.
And so good to know, right? So no, that makes sense.
Write them all down. Like
yeah,
that's what
and then it's in front of you.
Yeah, that's one of the first things I do with my clients is like, tell me where all your debts are. What are the debts? What are the minimum required payments? What's the interest rates? Is it a fixed or variable rate? So we have an idea of what's going on there. And then you can take a look at the whole picture when you're dealing with lots of debts to prioritize which ones should we aggressively pay off and which ones should we just do the minimum payment until that number one priority debt is paid off. And then you can move on to number 2, 3, and 4, and etc.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have your clear path of where you're going and it feels a little bit better.
Exactly.
We had another question. How do you build a diverse and safe portfolio to start saving up for retirement? And kind of second part, how do you build good credit with a credit card?
Let's do the credit first, because I feel like I sort of answered the first.
Yeah, the other one.
Already. So how to build good credit? I get those questions all the time. And the lame answer is it's just about being responsible with credit. So it's like paying your bills on time and specifically like your phone bill. So that's reported on your credit. So a lot of people don't know that. It's like, it's actually really good to always make sure you're paying off your phone bill on time. And then other bills also important, but specifically your debt. So never, miss a payment that can negatively affect your credit score. And really just like being smart with your money. And there's a couple other things. For instance, a lot of people don't realize that with your credit cards, you really shouldn't be using more than 30% of your available credit limit. A lot of people think that, I can just use 100% or 70%.
Yeah, it really affects your credit. Yeah.
Actually, it negatively affects your credit because what it does is it signals to the lenders that, I think they're not having a good time with their money. I think they're like a little bit risky. So that makes us feel, not so good about them. So we're going to, that's going to reflect in your credit score.
Yeah. And it shows that you may be living outside of your means, right? And you're
absolutely. Exactly. So there's a couple things. I have a guide somewhere on my website. It's like jessicamoorhouse.com/credit best practices. And I have kind of just like a nice little list that you can just put on your wall or read it once in a while. Another book that I also recommend if you are a big nerd and really want to like learn about credit in Canada is this book from a friend of mine called Richard Moxley. It's called The Credit Game. And then actually he deals with credit and all these questions all the time. And he wrote a very short, concise book about all the things you need to know, specifically in Canada, which I think is helpful.
Yeah, it is nice to have it specifically in Canada so it like pertains to what you're doing. Yeah. That's great. Someone is asking, how can you stop spending on takeout? So maybe tips for like making sure that you're budgeting, I guess, for this. Yeah.
Yeah. Like there's nothing wrong with takeout as long as you know specifically like every paycheck or every month, how much am I allowing myself to spend on that? Now, if you feel like you're always making an excuse like I'm tired, it was a long day. I mean, we all do that.
Yes.
One thing that I do is like delete those apps on your phone, like log out, make it very difficult for you to get in there. That's one helpful tip. And also I think it really comes down to like prioritizing your time in a different way. And so making a plan for when you're going to go grocery shopping and making a plan for when you go grocery shopping, what are you buying and what meals, and then meal prep, which I know is so not fun, but it's kind of the only way to get around with that. For me, one thing that I do is when we're at the grocery store, and there's, I'm not a big fan of frozen meals, but sometimes you need some emergency meals is what I call them. So basically I think it's like, if we didn't have this like frozen lasagna to pop in the oven, we would be doing takeout. So having some emergency meals in the freezer, I find is a very big help for me.
Meal prep might not be fun for some people, but I love it. Like I love nothing more than getting groceries. Cause I know myself and with how much I'm working and everything that if I don't have meals prepped, like I will spend $60 on takeout, or we'll go here or there. And it's just, I just know that for myself. So it's just knowing and being honest with yourself and just prepping for it. Right.
Exactly. And you can make it fun. Like one thing that I do to motivate myself to work out, which I feel like is very linked to personal finance, is like, I get to watch like one of my favorite shows while I'm working out. So you can do the same thing. It's like listen to like your favorite podcast or some music, or watch a show while you're making dinner. So you actually look forward to it. Another thing that you can do in terms of how you have your banking structure, and this is what I recommend for people when they're budgeting, so they don't like, when they figure out how much can I spend on variable expenses, a grocery takeout, whatever, have either a second checking account linked to a debit card or a prepaid Visa or MasterCard, which there's a couple companies like Coho and Stacked in Canada, where you basically every paycheck, you give yourself that allowance, and then that's how much you have to spend. So when you use a credit card, you've got like this really big balance that you can, or credit limit, you can use so much money. When you kind of give yourself that allowance, you're like, well, you only got $10 more until payday. So
it wisely,
I guess we're gonna be,
that's a very good point. If maybe you just know yourself and you know that that's going to be difficult, just having a prepaid card, that's perfect. I've never heard that before. So that's good to know.
Well, it's helpful because it's basically the same strategy as doing like the cash envelope system, except in this kind of weird world we are. There was a time where you couldn't even use cash at the grocery store. They wouldn't allow it. So that's why I'm like, I'm a little bit more fan of like the debit card, because everyone kind of uses those. Yeah. It's
so easy to do, right? So I am going to ask one more question and then we'll kind of close out from there.
Okay.
This one's a great question, actually. What tips would you give to new immigrants in Canada in terms of finances?
Ooh. I feel like I may not be the best person to ask because I'm not a new immigrant. So I feel like that's a very great question. I would actually point you to a blog that's actually pretty good. And it always comes out when I am like researching this. It's called Savvy New Canadians. And so I believe he was an immigrant. And so he's done a lot of research about that. So that might be a really great resource for you. I'd say kind of when you are a new immigrant, the things to look out for, I suppose, is typically when you open a bank account, you're going to go with one of the big banks. And so they do charge you fees. So just be aware of that. And I think really what's really important is understanding the different kind of banking system and tax system in Canada, because it will be very different than where you come from. So taking the time, unfortunately, there's a lot to know, but looking on I'm always on Canada.ca, like the CRA's website for all that information. Just take some time to really get familiar with some of these things. And a great place to start is like reading other people's blogs based out of Canada. So you have a better sense of like, what are some, terms they're using or products they're talking about or companies that I should be aware of, and get more familiar with that.
Yeah, perfect. I think we have time. I'll do one more and then we'll kind of round out here. So Marion is saying the only no fee bank that she can think of is Tangerine. Do you know of others?
Oh, there's tons of others.
Okay.
I have a blog post on my website that has a list of a bunch of them, but off the top of my head, we've got Tangerine, of course, is kind of the first one. There's Simply Financial. There's Motive Financial, Modus Bank. I'm going to pull it up because it's going to drive me bonkers.
Please do.
Because there's so many great no-fee banks. And I kind of feel like, honestly, because there's so much variety, I'm just opening it up. And I feel like there's only like one more besides that. Yeah, I wrote one that's like 5. There's probably a little bit more than 5, but these are the ones that I'm more familiar with and I've actually used most of them. But we've got, Alterna Bank is the other one I'm thinking of. Alterna Bank, Motive Financial, Modus Bank, Simply Financial, and Tangerine.
Okay, good to know.
Oh, another one I should mention actually is EQ Bank. EQ Bank, it's totally online, and their product, they have GICs as well, but they have a savings account, but it kind of works like a checking account because I think they do offer a debit card. So that's another one to look out for.
Perfect. And that's on your website too?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Perfect. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So
can I actually add one more thing? Because I had a few,
of course,
of the same question on my Instagram, and I don't know if they were able to join or whatever, but it was just a question about if I have a pension from my work, how should I know how much I should save for retirement? And I get this question a lot. People are very confused when they get a pension. Do I still have to save for retirement? Yes.
Yeah.
So what's important to figure out is what kind of pension plan you have. Is it defined benefit or defined contribution? That'll definitely give you some clarity on how much will you actually get when you're retired. I think most of the companies that offer those pension plans, they usually have some sort of calculator or interface that you can plug in your information and it'll tell you how much you need. But going back to what we kind of talked about at the beginning of this session was, first, you need to figure out what is the income you would like to have in retirement. And so when you're doing that calculation, and again, lots of different retirement calculators online, like the government has one, which is actually pretty good. You put in, okay, well, I'm getting this pension from work, and I'm also going to get CPP, the Canada Pension Plan, when I retire, and old age security. So we've got those. Then what's kind of left over is if maybe you're totally fine and you're totally covered, you're going to meet your income requirement. If not, then you're going to need to do some personal savings.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I'm like, it's such a great idea to do your own personal investments because very well, that could help you retire earlier or have more money in retirement to spend.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's very good to know, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, so I just want to let everyone know, anybody watching today, Encircled is offering a special discount code. So if you add in at checkout the code Jessica Moorhouse, and we'll put the code in the chat as well for everybody, you can get $25 off of orders of 200 or more, and that includes free shipping.
Nice.
And we're going to have that code live until September 12th at 11:59 p.m. So until we hit the 13th. So again, we'll share that code. But as well, before we go, I just wanted to re-mention Jessica Moorhouse is also the host of the Mo Money podcast, which I have checked out. It's amazing. Highly recommend. And then do you want to let everyone know just quickly, we'll put it in the chat as well, but just your website and your Instagram handle, because your Instagram also has a lot of great tips.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So with the Mo Money podcast, as you mentioned, it will be back with new episodes at the end of September. So subscribe now, but you can, there's a whole back catalog. You can find everything about me at jessicamoorhouse.com. So there's like videos, podcasts, blogs, there's a whole shop. So you can download budget spreadsheets. There's everything you can think of. But of course, you can always follow me on Instagram and DM me if you have more questions, which I'm happy to answer at Jessica I Moorhouse at Jessica I Moorhouse.
We'll put it in the chat too. We'll put it in the chat. I'll put you on the spot. Yeah. Perfect. Awesome. Yes. So everyone will include that. We'll mention the discount code again, which is just Jessica Moorhouse. But thank you so much. I know I learned so much, and I loved all of the questions and everything.
You had some great questions, and also
they were good.
Like things after, like she knows her stuff. Actually,
trying. I'm glad it came across like that.
Yeah, you did.
Awesome. Well, have a great rest of your Saturday. Thank you so much. It was so great talking to you.
It was so fun to be a part of this. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Okay. See you. Bye.
Bye.